In this jank-filled game review, Dom cuts the homeless population in half, genocides an underground cannibal society, and is a general nuisance to the Moscow Metro Company.
It's about time I covered some certified old school jank, and in this video I have a case that's equally as captivating as it is flawed. The Hunt, a.k.a. Черная Метка,
Черная Метка, чертова метка, нет!
which more literally translates to Black Mark, is the Russian answer to Condemned Criminal Origins. It's got that dark and gritty atmosphere, first-person brawling with hobos using makeshift weapons, the incredibly useful phone, just about everything you'd expect from a Condemned game. It even looks like Half-Life 2 in some parts where you're wielding a crowbar. Now, long-time viewers might raise an eyebrow at me covering a Russian game, since I try to avoid promoting Russian products these days for obvious reasons, but I have some excuses this time. I initially planned to cover a game that's been on my radar for years, Gorky 0, a sequel to the Polish cult classic Gorky 17. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get the game running. On Windows 11 the game wouldn't launch at all, and the best I got was an error saying that categories.set file could not be opened. I got a bit further using a Windows XP virtual machine. The game would launch, but it would fail to load any textures, resulting in everything being displayed in pure white. It's a little infuriating when I've seen other people run the game just fine, in 4K no less. If anyone has a clue how to fix those issues, please let me know. I've been keeping an eye out for old jank games for a long time, but you know, it's surprisingly difficult to find anything that's not Russian, since that country is pretty much the jank capital. I'd love to discover more obscure games from more unexpected countries. Where are my South American or Asian gems at? I guess those are rarely translated to English. I also like when the games have something curious about their development history to talk about in videos, so that eliminates even more options. Now, The Hunt is certainly an interesting case. I was quite late to the party when it comes to Condemned. I had my first impressions video several years back, but it quickly rose to become one of my favorite video games. The Hunt is immediately interesting to me, because there are very few first-person melee brawlers around, especially ones that also have a similar mood to Condemned that I enjoy so much. The Hunt also just so happens to be a piece of abandonware that is no longer sold anywhere. The studio behind it, Orion, seems to no longer be active either. These are the guys who are probably most infamous for their Stalin Subway games. It's a game where you play as a KGB agent trying to save Stalin. If you don't see why that's distasteful, it's pretty much an equivalent of a German studio making a game about certain double-letter troops helping out their great Austrian buddy. I hate YouTube censorship so much. Some of Orion games, including Stalin Subway, are still being sold on Steam, but that's done by various shovelware publishers. Some poor bloke is still paying for Orion's website domain, but the company has been radio silent since 2015. Some former Orion devs have launched an MMO called Xyson in 2014 under a different studio, but that game hasn't left early access since. It might have been fate, but just after I started looking into Orion, an interview with one of their former programmers was released, confirming that Orion did indeed silently close down. Bottom line, even if this video attracts players to this game, no one's really profiting from The Hunt anymore. Politics aside, The Hunt is a game that intrigued me right from the first time I saw screenshots of it. I'm a huge fan of Condemned Criminal Origins, and to my knowledge, there isn't anything else quite like it. I'm also always curious about jank lower budget games, so that's a great combo. What's more interesting is that The Hunt is based on a short story sharing its name, Черная Метка, by the Ukrainian sci-fi author Andrei Dashkov. It's almost the same thing as Stephen King's The Running Man. So The Hunt is not only a copy of Condemned, it is also a reinterpretation of something that itself is kind of a copy. So I went out of my way to find a copy of Черная Метка, and since it's never been translated to English, I had to do with machine translation. Since I'm familiar with the flow of Slavic languages and certain expressions, the translation wasn't too terrible and got the point across. I would even say I enjoyed reading it while listening to the gloomy Gorky 17 soundtrack in the background. There were some pretty broken parts though.
Even now, Nick's loins ached sweetly. Yes, what an erection he'd lost. In vain. He was even more offended because, having realized the futility of her trap, the blonde, she stepped on the gas and, rustling past him, angrily threw out, "Fucking impotent!" And he, not impotent. Quite the opposite.
It was a neat little story overall, but it was vulgar in an untasteful way. And I'm saying that as someone who is far from a saint. It's sort of done to depict the depravity of the society, but it's also a post-Soviet man's dated sensibility spoken through. Both Черная Метка and the Running Man have the same core idea. In the future, the regime becomes increasingly totalitarian, and mega corporations start running a game show where a single selected person gets hunted and killed for sport. The execution of the idea is a bit different though, and it feels like it's the difference between American and Slavic styles of writing. I have rewatched the Arnold Schwarzenegger version of The Running Man to refresh my memory, as to my knowledge it's the best known version of the story. Yet it seems like it's a pretty loose interpretation. I didn't bother with the book, as I feel like it would be a bit of an overkill for this video since it's detached from the game by several degrees. But from the summary of it, I gather that the Running Man is portraying the situation in a more grandiose and bombastic way, with the corporations being the absolute villain, manipulating everything else. So generally, it's a dystopian action thriller. Черная Метка takes a bit more of an introspective psychological approach, and that's something I am into. I didn't show a clip from the Treasure Island in the beginning of the video just for laughs. It's actually where the concept of a black mark is taken from. The short story directly quotes Treasure Island regarding it. It's pretty much a message of death sentence. The hunt makes the black mark out to be something that people can just pass on to one another, so the society becomes very untrustful of one another, knowing that they might be sentenced to death for any slip-up. That means nearly any member of the society can also get involved in the hunt, which actually makes it into a perfect premise for a Condemned style beat-em-up, where regular lowlifes bash each other with impromptu weapons. I won't be comparing the hunt to the Running Man too much, but I think it's interesting to see how it fares in comparison to the original short story. I'll go through the whole game level by level and bring up plot points as they become relevant. And one last thing before I get to the actual game, the hunt is actually a pretty rare game, as it has never been released into the international market. I can only speculate about the reasons why. Some might say that it's so close to Condemned Criminal Origins that it could be considered plagiarism, but I'm not too sure about that. There are plenty of other games that had copycats down to really old stuff like Doom and Diablo. Although that Chinese Horizon Zero Dawn copycat did get into a lawsuit with Sony, so who knows. I've read some rumors that Orion might have acquired some Condemned developer build through their publisher, but I've seen no source confirming that, so it seems pretty baseless to me. There are some pre-existing songs in the game, maybe that could have caused some licensing issues, but that also feels like a fairly minor detail. Out of all the countries, France was the only one to release the hunt outside of Russia, and that's the version I've been playing. My French is a lot worse than my Russian though, so why would I do that? Well, as it turns out, the hunt was fully voiced in English for the French version, and it makes it even weird that the game has never been released to a wider market, since the translation already existed. All the text was still in French though, but that's where an unofficial patch comes in. All the text is stored in regular TXT files, so it's pretty easy to replace. It seems to be more literally translated from the Russian version rather than transcribed from the professional voiceover in the French version, so the voices and the text don't align, but at least the game is playable. Another thing I found very peculiar was the installer. I had never encountered an installer in French before, but it just so happened that all the accented symbols were replaced with Cyrillic letters, so it made it a very strange unintentional mix of languages. Quick spoiler warning, this video contains spoilers for the entirety of the hunt and Andrei Dashkov's The Black Mark, as well as some spoilers for Stephen King's The Running Man and the 1987 film adaptation. Anyway, the game begins with the main character driving back home and listening to some exposition over the radio, and it so happens to explain the core principles of the hunt. If the black mark is just thrown away, the person dies. If the mark is not passed to someone else, the person will be hunted and killed. Pretty simple. And then the dude just gets screamed at by some random fella, blacks out, and wakes up in his apartment. The phone rings. It's some mysterious stranger that goes by B, and he informs the main character that he now has the black mark in his pocket. B also tells that there is an anti-mark group that wants to stop the hunt and could inject the player with an antidote to the black mark virus that kills people if the black mark is disposed of. The player then can read up on some info about the protagonist on his computer. The name is Nikolai. He is a 30-year-old web designer. He makes $3,000 a month. That's a lot, at least for Russia. The action takes place in Moscow, 2020. It was near future when the game released, but it is history now. I guess we'll see how accurate the prediction was, but it's fun seeing Flash animation in Nick's expertise. RIP Flash. Also, yes, the text looks kinda broken. I think it's a resolution related issue. Another theory is that the Latin font might be taller than the Cyrillic one and it wasn't accounted for. But yeah, there are already some differences from the short story. The main character is named Nick in both versions, but that's where the similarities end. The setting in the short story was left more ambiguous, which I prefer, as the near future is always predicted wrong. More importantly, in the game Nick received the black mark with absolutely no explanation. Meanwhile, in the original story, the way he got the mark took a good chunk of the whole thing. It was an entire drama among the people closest to him. It's a lot harder to pass the mark on to a complete stranger due to lack of trust in a pretty paranoid society, so people would be willing to sacrifice those closest to them to survive themselves. First it was Nick's parents that got the mark, and passed it between one another. Then the mark got passed to Nick's best friend since childhood, someone who he would trust with everything. Yet that guy would pass the mark on to Nick's wife, through her cheating on Nick with his best friend. Nick's wife passed the mark to him through a kiss during his birthday. It was an entire life-ruining psychological drama. After receiving the mark, Nick watched the Black Mark show and found out how all the closest people to him betrayed him, how his careful life was for naught, and that he no longer has anything to live for. It also explains Nick's turn to violence better, as he no longer had anything to lose and was pretty much a cornered animal fighting tooth and nail for survival. Meanwhile, the game's Nick, well, you'll see. Coming back to the game, we can see Nick having a smartphone in a very much the same vein as Condemned. Every level there's some text to read about Nick's state of mind and the current objective, which is nice and a decent way to incorporate some inner monologue. Right off the bat, I was impressed with the game's visuals. The environment looks quite detailed and the lighting is pretty moody. There's even volumetric lights. The hunt definitely looked good for a 2008 Russian game, and I'd say it aged really well visually. The Soviet-looking stairwell Nick gets out to is also very fitting for a horror setting. Good prediction of the future too, because those still exist in 2026. Some hunter starts rushing in from the bottom floor, so I'm forced to flee to the roof. Things immediately start looking very nasty and grungy, and that's exactly the vibe I'm here for. There's a random hobo sleeping, but kicking his balls doesn't seem to wake him up. I get down through a different yet identical looking stairwell, but the hunters catch up to me. There are more trying to gun me down in the street, so I have to run. I don't run exactly fast, but I still make it to a metro station. Even though it's a new level, the hunters are still chasing me and it's genuinely unnerving, in a good way. I would have loved to take in the views more, but I actually felt in danger. Mr. B instructs me to jump over the train tracks at the end of the platform, and that initiates a pretty cool cutscene. I'd like to take a moment to interject about the writing here again. There's not really any major contradictions, but I found it interesting how in the original story there was actually a certain code of honor to the hunt. First of all, the mark was sort of an equalizer. It wasn't allowed to be passed to the disabled, children or elderly, because the hunt had to be fair, so to say. What matters in this moment more is the way hunters would behave. They would specifically train for the hunt, so it would be a matter of honor to kill the prey in close combat. Using guns, and especially sniper rifles, was considered shameful and could even be penalized, unless the show would get to a point where the showrunners would really want to get rid of the prey. So it makes sense that people would start shooting later in the game, but people immediately opening up with guns in the first level is a little strange. But I guess in terms of the game, it's an effective way to build overwhelming odds without having to bog down the performance with a ton of enemies. Another interesting thing about the honor system is that the Marked One's face would be censored in the show, so it wouldn't be impossibly overwhelming with just about anyone recognizing them. Random citizens can still attack for the reward money, but it's harder for them to deduct who the Marked One is. So you may ask, why even run and not just hide somewhere instead? The reason is that the official hunters may have radars that can locate the mark, so they would constantly be chasing. Okay, back to the game now. This area of underground tunnels is probably my favorite in the whole game in terms of atmosphere. It's very gloomy, everything looks dirty and abandoned, and the enemies here are mostly random hobos and lowlights wielding clubs and pipes. I must say the glass-breaking physics look quite impressive. Just like Condemned, the hunt does this thing where you need certain weapons to be able to open specific passages, which is a nice incentive to keep switching weapons, and it adds some light puzzling to the game. The first tool required to open a door is a crowbar, and while having that in hand, this level straight up looks like Half-Life 2. There are also the very Half-Life 2 looking flying cameras. They're mostly an annoyance, and they can ruin sneaking by shining their lights at you. I would say that's the most futuristic thing in this game, but considering how popular drones have become, it's not entirely unrealistic, just a slightly different depiction of what we ended up building. The combat system is very similar to the one in Condemned Criminal Origins. It's just pretty basic attacks and blocks, but you have to time them well. I don't mind the simplicity, and the timing for blocking is extremely generous. The melee combat feels absolutely visceral in first person, and I can't stress enough how much I love that kind of thing. Every encounter just feels so intimate, and that feeling is just elevated by the gritty atmosphere. Then there are these vending machines where you can purchase various consumable items. Don't forget to pick the items up, because they don't get added to the inventory automatically. For some reason it takes around 15 seconds to just load in this JPEG of a menu. After roughly 30 minutes of gameplay, some objects started flickering and the frame rate was tanking even on a pretty high-end rig by current standards. I think the game had some issue with the higher resolutions, because the problems mostly disappeared after lowering my resolution and nothing else. The game would behave a bit weird with that stuff. Surprisingly, it supports 4K right out of the box, but when I run that in windowed mode, the window size far exceeds my 4K monitor and fully covers my second monitor. I managed to contain it to a single monitor, but even then I saw plenty of jagged edges, which shouldn't be happening much with the DPI I have going on. The game has no anti-aliasing settings, by the way. I lowered the resolution to 1440p, and now the game's window was pretty much exactly my monitor size, which made me think that the game might be calculating resolutions wrong somehow, and I was rendering the game at way above 4K, but who knows. Oddly enough, I saw absolutely no visual difference after lowering the resolution. So this video is in some sort of a Schrodinger's resolution. It may or may not be in 4K, and I don't have a reliable way to tell. Anyway, occasionally I stumble into enemies talking to one another, and it's quite amusing to listen to them.
Any copper?
Yeah, there's a bit.
Huh? Like, what wire should I cut? Black or red?
Doesn't matter. Power's out.
There's a lot of precious metal.
Uh-huh. It'll get us some vodka.
How are we gonna share it?
Like brothers. I get more, 'cause I'm older.
And what if somebody finds this place?
So what? Smash his face. That's all.
It says here 5,000 volts. Is that a lot?
Nah, your coat won't even have burns on it.
I found it a little odd that the enemies mostly had Brooklyn accents. It's a fairly decent attempt, but I think the original Russian voice lines are a bit more immersive.
Наколем ща цвет мета много. Ага, водяры наберем. Делить как будем? По-братски. Мне, как старшему брату, больше. Слышь, а если сюда кто припрет? И чё? Вгрызло раз и хорош. А тут написано 5000 вольт. Это дофига? Не, это как раз чтобы тулуп твой целым не достался.
I wonder if they chose actors with Brooklyn accents randomly, or did they think that's the best equivalent of thug style of speech? I'm honestly not sure what English dialect would be the best equivalent of Gopnik speech. I want to say British hooligans could be close, but that's very recognizable British. I think the best possible choice is something I've heard in the English dub of the Night's Watch film. Every single character had a pretty thick Russian accent, so there was no doubt about their nationality.
It's for you. Cover for me, will you?
Yeah, your sausages are exploding.
I think the original Stalker games also did something similar. Eventually, I get to use my phone, and it's a pretty cool mechanic. In Condemned, it felt a bit ridiculous how the protagonist would carry around all that spy gear, taking all sorts of samples and then sending them through a Nokia phone with buttons. Now Nick has a proper smartphone, and he has to follow the reception bars to find Wi-Fi routers he can hack. That actually makes sense since he's a web developer. I also found the inclusion of Wi-Fi routers pretty interesting. While the technology existed since the 90s, in my experience Wi-Fi wasn't common until the 2010s, when smartphones started getting popular. Hell, I didn't even have home internet yet in 2008 when the game was released. There were some smartphones in 2008, but they weren't that common yet, so I'd say the Hunt made pretty good predictions with both the smartphones and the Wi-Fi. It also works with the lore, because in the short story there would be routers installed all over the place to help track the Black Mark. Anyway, hacking the routers allows the player to look through security cameras and is required to unlock some doors. And hey, the game also has a stealth system. It's pretty nice being able to stick in the shadows and take out enemies without suffering any damage, and I'm really glad that stealth is completely optional. You can get limited time night vision goggles that would help you sneak up on enemies, but it's rarely dark enough for that, and I felt like I saw just fine without the goggles or a flashlight. Then there are possibilities to earn money through bets. While The Hunt makes a lot of money just through being an extremely popular TV show, there's also a lot of cash being moved through illegal underground bets. In the game you can bet a certain sum that you'll perform a certain action. For example, you perform stealth kills on the next 4 enemies, and if you're successful you can earn yourself a respectable sum of rubles. I never did that though, because the betting menu would be in French for me, and I had no clue what the objective was until I bet the money and then could review the task on my phone. At least it wasn't anything vital. Throughout the game you can read up on some lore concerning the Hunt, and while it's a fair bit more mild than anything in the book, it's still nice to get some context about how it affects people. Squaticus Sovieticus. I'm glad those are no longer present here. Quick note about the user interface. It looks like it's ripped straight from Condemned, but it's a cool style, so I can't blame it. It's very grungy. Unlike Condemned, The Hunt hides all of the UI when it's not needed, including the health bar, which makes the game a bit more immersive and cinematic. I like that. Eventually, I made my way to where I was meant to meet my guide, but someone else got to him first. His last dying words: I have to make my way to some sort of a factory. Also, Mr. B sometimes gets called V in the text. An easy mistake to make when translating from Cyrillic, but it made me think I was going mad until I rewatched the footage. The next level takes place outside at night, next to some industrial buildings and train tracks, and it looks absolutely beautiful, even despite the fact that lighting was broken for most of the level, as I found out later. By the way, the vending machines have a sound effect ripped straight from Half-Life. There's a section that has some landmines, but it's very small and the only one like that in the entire game. The first enemy after the landmine field has a bell that deactivates the mines, so it stops being an issue immediately. There's also a radio that plays some extremely loud music. The music from the radios in this game seems to completely ignore any volume settings. The song is Vremya Vyberat by Animal Jazz, a band that's most famous for their song Tripolosky. Not the hard bass one, but an emo song. None of the licensed songs are listed in the credits, by the way. Speaking of songs, all audio files are easily accessible in the game's folders, and a lot of them are uncompressed WAV files. Actually, the same goes for most of the game files. This might as well be open source. The folder structure is abysmal though, as all the songs used in the game are scattered throughout different folders. Maybe that's why they are unaffected by volume settings. Since I touched upon the music, let's talk about the way this game sounds. I absolutely love the main menu theme. It's this chill guitar tune that I could keep listening to over and over again, but it has some really unnerving sound effects going on in the background. If not for the baked-in sound effects, I would gladly use it in my future videos. The licensed tracks aside, the rest of the soundtrack is some barely noticeable dark ambient. For a game like this, where tension matters a lot, silence can be a lot more useful and effective than intense tracks, so it was the correct choice. But the thing is, the game is never really silent. The ambience is pretty faint, but it really works well building the mood. I especially like the ambient track in this factory level. It's melancholic, but oddly comforting. The fights would have some brutalist industrial beats playing, and while they're intense, they're not too over the top, which complements the game's feel. There's just one combat theme in the entire game though. That's a shame. Also, all the original tracks in the game are only around 1 minute long, which makes them repetitive fast. A nice little detail I only saw in the factory level was being able to hear some metal music coming out from the headphones of fallen enemies. For example, this guy was listening to Spasita Nashi Dushi by Solaris. I think I've seen the regular soundtrack of this game uploaded by someone else, but maybe I should do a playlist of licensed songs in this game, just for the sake of documentation. Anyway, I started having some troubles in this level. I was no longer fighting random hobos, but actual hunters, and they were a fair amount tougher. There were 2 of them always walking together, and the 3rd one had a gun. These guys would attack a lot faster and had significantly more health. I kept dying to them over and over again. Luckily, the autosave system in the game is pretty good. Even when I wasn't religiously quick-saving, I would never feel like I lost a lot of progress after dying. But yeah, I tried taking them out by stealth, unsuccessfully. What I ended up figuring out was simple in hindsight, but it's something the game doesn't really explain. You have to hold your mouse to do a stronger attack, and it makes a world of difference. Hitting the head also increases the damage a lot. Doing this, the combat becomes a bit slower, but also more tactical, as you can't block as easily while charging an attack, so you have to time things more carefully. With these guys down, I also have my first gun. The pistol is not that great, but it is ranged. A very nice feature is that you can club people with the gun after you run out of ammo. The ammo in this game is very limited, and you can't really save the guns for a more tactical opportunity, as you need to keep switching weapons to be able to pass various barriers. Then there's this incredibly annoying thing where the game likes to put the healing items on tall shelves above the character's height. Yet there's no jumping or climbing mechanics, so it's near impossible to reach those items. Essentially, you have to keep moving back and forth and hope that you'll be able to clip through the hitbox for a split second. In the corridors inside the factory, there's a tiny puzzle where you have to turn valves to disable hot steam that hurts you. It's way too basic to be interesting. It's a bit of a shame that enemies don't have friendly fire. That would make things a lot more chaotic, in a fun way. But there's an occasional scripted sequence where enemies fight one another. Like this one where two hunters get into a fight over a petty argument.
It was I who finished this one.
Bullshit. You shot after I removed half of her head already.
You? You can't even hit an elephant. What are you talking about?
Hey, don't be pushy, okay?
Who's being pushy, huh? Stop barking at me, you scum.
Who? Me? Screw you.
What? Bitch? Take this!
This long crowbar I picked up was likely my least favorite weapon in the whole game. It just felt too clunky. Generally, the weapons in this game feel pretty good, but none of them have any stats displayed, so you have to go by feel. These machetes were pretty good. They were called swords in the translation, but I don't think I would call it a sword. It's more of a machete, or maybe a very large knife.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
Meanwhile, the weapon that was called a machete was more of a kukri. I think my favorite was the sledgehammer. I think it might have been the weapon that did the most damage in a single hit, and sometimes it would even knock enemies over. There was this little moment where I could knock some barrels down the stairs to kill an enemy. It would have been lovely if the game had more environmental kill opportunities like Dark Messiah, but they were extremely rare in this game. The execution of it felt clunky, but it's cute that they at least attempted it. Towards the end of the level, there is a boss fight with no build-up whatsoever. It's just some dude that bursts in through the window with a motorcycle, falls on his ass and disfigures his face. What a dumbass. He acts mostly like a regular enemy, just with a bit more health.
What freaks? Happy to draw my blood? Laugh while you can. I'll live.
Also, watch this. A lightning strikes, and the game suddenly remembers that it has a lighting system. It instantly looks so much better. If only that happened sooner, this level would have looked even more spectacular. I'm not sure if I've seen anything like this happen elsewhere. It feels like the game forgets about the lighting in future levels too, but it doesn't recover like in this one. Oh hey, a TV!
Whoa. TV.
Yeah. TV. TV.
We can watch a fresh report on what happened on the hunt. I find it a bit weird that any mention of Black Mark is removed from the English dub in favor of the hunt. Also, see this lady? That's Olga Buzova. That's an actual Russian celebrity. Not exactly a great one. By the time this game was released, she was known for her outbursts in the reality show Dom 2. Hey, that's my name. Dom is such a good name. They did make Dom too. And man, this brings me back. I haven't seen Russian reality shows in ages. They would start fighting like animals every single time. I guess the hunt is just the natural progression. Just Moscow things. Aside from being generally obnoxious and making awful music, Olga Buzova also openly endorsed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so May should go in the direction of the Russian warship. I guess the silver lining is that she was known to be a pretty immoral person, participating in immoral shows, so it was fitting that she would host the hunt. I doubt that the developers thought of it as deep. They likely hired her just trying to get some clout. Oh, look at this guy go! There is a church after getting out of the factory, and it's a pretty nice and distinctly Russian set piece. There are also dudes with shotguns, and they kill me incredibly fast. I guess that's really sick, if a little infuriating. After I dispatch them, I get locked in place, and some dudes in blue jackets come for me. Another loading screen comic starts, and they look nothing like their game counterparts in them. Apparently, that's the anti-mark guys. Their boss injects me with a blocker that's supposed to neutralize the Black Mark virus, but it doesn't work, which means I have to win the show legitimately. So I think I go to the church next? I'm not entirely sure. In any case, the floor ends up caving in and I fall into some underground tunnels full of cannibals. Why does this game have cannibals? I don't know, but I don't really mind. The original story also had a brief church bit, so having one here is a nice callback, but it plays out completely differently. Originally, Nick went to the church looking for shelter, and it is symbolically supposed to be a shelter for anyone without any prejudice, yet the priest would only accept to provide help if Nick showed him his dingaling, which made Nick rightfully think that the priest acted the same with other people and was likely a child diddler.
Šveikė berniukai, kur einate, einam pas mane į bažnyčią, žurnalų pažiūrėsim, aš už altoriaus vonę turiu, kur kartu išsimaudysim, saldainių galėsiu duoti, eini su manim primokinsiu dalykų gyvenime, kur net nesapnavo berniukai, berniukai, einam su senuku, suteikit man šiek tiek saulės. Nu eimi va. Ką tu čia skali ant manęs svolačiau, tu eikis čia šalin, berniukai palaukit.
And so Nick knocked the priest out. While I'm very much fine with the critique of the church, it was very shallow and didn't really add anything to the short story except for some extra vulgarity, which wasn't helping the story very much either. The cannibals though, they're completely random. I guess it would be showing how bad things had gotten in the future of 2020, yet these tunnels were full of crates of potatoes, so the cannibals had other options. They were in it just for the love of the game, and honestly, pretty based. There was another one of the very rare environmental kill opportunities. There is a radio that airs a report about Nick being off the radar since he's underground, and that the show's popularity is dropping while not being able to see him. It would be very anticlimactic if he died off-screen. After some time, the game started flickering a lot and performance started dropping. After restarting the game, everything was fine again. I guess the game just got a bit tired. It's okay, we all get tired sometimes. The only quirk that happened after reloading was me not being able to pick up weapons from the ground. Instead, they were glued back to corpses' hands and stuck upright. Anyway, the cannibal tunnels, while a bit labyrinthian, ended fairly quickly. So, we've had some Soviet apartments, run-down underground facilities, and abandoned factories. Even the creepy mine shafts, while a little outlandish, were still fitting aesthetically and atmospherically to the overall dystopian Moscow mood. Now you'll never guess what the next level is. A clown-infested amusement park. What the fuck? To quote Olga Buzova,
Ничего не понимаю вообще.
It's such a tonal whiplash. It feels like the game is pulling a Borderlands moment on me. Everything is bright and colorful, overexposed actually, and the weapons here are as ridiculous as everything else. There's some annoying sounding announcer. There's some unskippable displays parodying the hunt, and that's where it's really weird that in the translation they refuse to refer to the black mark. It would all be scenes about people passing the black mark, but instead they would say the hunt. And it just makes a lot less sense.
Honey, today's our anniversary. We've been together for a week.
What? What anniversary? Are you trying to get money from me again? Shut up already. I took you out to a cafe yesterday. We even went to the river.
No, dear. You got it all wrong. It was me who wanted to give you a present.
Ah! Let's see it then. What the hell is this? The hunt? The hunt?
There's a little minigame where you have to shoot targets with a paintball gun, and it's pretty hilarious that you can keep using it on enemies. It's horribly ineffective, but it's possible to kill someone with it if you stick with it. That's quite amusing. It's like this game's equivalent of the pencil in John Wick. Even a seemingly harmless item can be lethal with enough determination. And I must admit, despite how stupid it is, it's pretty fun fighting the clowns. Because they're less concerned with fighting, and instead they just keep fucking around and taunting the player.
Mr. Bombastic, tell me fantastic.
I don't know, maybe the game was trying to make the clown scary, but I don't have that phobia at all. What was driving me mad in this level was the sounds. While it had an actual soundtrack playing, it kept looping this short ambient track of a tape record skipping. It was an absolutely horrible, non-stop cacophony. Get clowncore here instead, please. At one point, a group of hunters got into the park and started fighting the clowns. It was quite amusing watching them fight from a distance. At the same time, I get a phone call telling me that I need to take the monorail to the television station, but it's real drowned out by all the noise. In one of the rooms, the clowns and hunters are beating each other to unbearably loud ska music. And it's so fucking stupid, I actually have to give the game some credit. That did crack me up. The song is Mir sozdan dla tebe by Distemper. When the level ends, the comic is at least trying to introduce the next boss. Or at least that's what I assume, because the translation is near incomprehensible. Next up, I end up in some sort of warehouses. The gloomy vibes are back. It was an alright level, but I'd say it was the least memorable one. At least I got to swing my favorite sledgehammer, and there were some opportunities to sneak in the dark again. Will you see me? What the fuck is it doing? And somehow did not see me. Wow. The boss in this level is wielding a chainsaw, but the main difficulty of the fight is that for some reason it just feels clunkier than fighting any other enemy. I think it messes with my animation somehow if I stick too close to the dude. The fight's not too hard though. Sadly, I don't get the chainsaw after defeating him, it just ceases to exist. The next comic in between levels introduces me to some crow ninjas waiting in ambush. This doesn't bode well. I end up in an underground parking lot and get another call from B. All he says is that I'm almost at my final destination and that my ratings are soaring high. There's a sleeping guard in a booth. He didn't bother me, but I killed him anyway. You know, just in case. I tried reading the text on this laptop, but the music on this radio was so overwhelmingly loud, I just couldn't concentrate. No clue how he could sleep to that. And the music is so distracting, holy shit, it's so loud.
Can you not just hit the radio?
No. Oh, actually. Thank you. Thank you for your bright mind. The song was Mir оживших машин by Top Display. This section would have been confusing if I didn't see it in a video prior to playing the game. I have to get these random oily rags and this tiny lighter on the desk that I previously missed completely. Then I have to get to this one specific car with an open gas tank and set it on fire to activate the sprinklers, which end up opening a gate. There is logic behind this, but the solution is a lot more specific than anything up to this point. I got stuck in the next section of the parking lot though, and it was a lot better of an example of how the game would confuse me. There would fairly consistently be moments where I wouldn't be entirely sure how to proceed, despite the levels being pretty small and the solutions being fairly close to the obstacles. It would most often boil down to me missing some little object in the environment. After this puzzle, I thought maybe I had to explode another car, since I had 3 oil rags. So I checked every single car again, but nope. Turns out I just missed the elevator button like a complete dumbass, because it was almost the exact same color as the wall behind it. Upon getting up, I end up in some office. It's exactly what you would expect from an office. My only complaint would be that for 2020, the computers were very outdated. Despite all displays still being in 4:3 aspect ratio, CRT monitors were still being used, and for some reason, the PCs would have side panels off, displaying some Asian hardware. I guess that's still more accurate than some holographic displays a lot of sci-fi tends to do. Oh hey, There's a vending machine purely for cigarettes. Most brands are fake, but still recognizable to their real-life counterparts, with just a few letters changed. Kingston. Wait, Kingston? That's still a real brand, but instead of cigarettes it's computer storage. Russians are straight up smoking gigabytes in 2020. Anyway, I decided to finally try out mines, as the game had provided me with some. Strangely enough, they only attach to walls. It takes a while for them to get activated, so they're a little clunky to use. I didn't find them too useful, because it's hard to predict when and where enemies will spawn. It can be fun to watch them get decimated in an instant and ragdoll away though. And then I ran into the Crow Ninja dudes. They were tough. The nastiest enemies in the whole game really. They had both a ton of health and they would attack very fast, making it very hard to get a hit in without receiving damage. They would also occasionally parry or dodge attacks, throwing the rhythm of the fight off. I hated these bastards. They also were so skinny compared to everyone else, they would actually appear like some ghost pinks. They would also have blue hair and clown makeup under their headpieces. The sickle weapons they drop also felt pretty crappy to me, so defeating them didn't even feel rewarding. It was a bit weird how I had to fight one of these guys in an empty pool like a boss in an arena. There was some build-up narration and everything, how he saw me as a worthy opponent and held no hatred, so it will be a fight of pure mastery. Yet I had already defeated one of these guys. What? After winning the fight, Nick just drops more insulting one-liners.
Mark feels absolutely nothing after killing its adversary. The Mark doesn't give a shit.
I must say, Nick's personality seems quite different in the game than in the short story. In Dashkow's version, Nick did become a bit of a savage after receiving the Black Mark, but the story was focused on his deteriorating mental state. His life was ruined, and the entire world was against him, so of course he started acting like a cornered animal, but he would still nearly throw up after his first kill and stuff like that. He would gradually get more used to killing, but that would be purely out of self-preservation, and it would be made clear that the hunters always were the more sadistic ones. Meanwhile, the game's Nick has absolutely no second thoughts about killing right from the start of the game, despite having received no such psychological trauma as his book counterpart. Even more, he spits insulting one-liners. I guess Schwarzenegger in The Running Man would also keep throwing out cheesy one-liners, but his character was always completely morally positive, whereas Nick feels very edgy or even sadistic. He completely disregards human life. Back to the game. I got to a little bar area, and I was a big fan of the table physics here. I had to fight another one of the ninja guys and have a shootout with multiple armed guys immediately after, which was fairly tough and required several attempts. That left me with pretty much no healing items. It was also kind of a turning point in the game. There were new enemies like policemen and soldiers, so more and more guns were being used. I was in the game for the melee brawling, but I didn't mind the more deadly escalation in the last sections of the game. Anyway, I get to the train, and my last destination is the Telecenter. Oh look, it's Olga Buzova again. This level has some strange visual glitches consistently turning the lighting on and off. I wasn't a fan of these later levels as the grungy textures and the dark atmosphere was mostly gone. Things would look well lit, sterile, and it would feel like a regular action flick and not a moody horror piece. This waterfall is making me dizzy. With this kind of level design and the lack of darkness, there were no more opportunities to sneak either. While I'm not a huge fan of stealth overall, it feels like a bit of a waste. Anyway, I was starting to have real trouble with the ninjas here, as I was running out of healing items. I had to do the fights near perfectly, but that felt impossible. The tactic I found to fight the ninjas was that I had to intentionally get close and block an attack, so I could stagger them and get an opening to strike myself. But the problem was that blocking these guys was really unreliable, and sometimes hits would still go through. After that, special forces guys with assault rifles started rushing in, and I was in a real pickle being out of ammo. I tried my best to take them out using mines, but setting them up was a little too clunky to be effective. I tried hiding in the dark using night vision goggles, but these guys had flashlights and spotted me immediately. Turns out I had missed a shotgun tucked away in a corner. That helped level things out. The game also gave me a ton of medkits after all these struggles. And you know what that means in gaming? It's boss battle time. The final boss had no build-up whatsoever. It was just some random bald dude with 2 hammers. The game also took my weapon away, and that was really frustrating because I had an assault rifle with a full clip. Anyway, the bald dude was no joke. He would swing his hammers relentlessly, and wouldn't even get staggered upon blocking, so there were no openings to hit him up close. I couldn't go back to pick up my gun either. There were no environmental opportunities to damage him. The one way to fight him that I figured out felt really janky, but I couldn't think of any more intentional way. His move speed was the lowest of any enemy in the game. I would run in, get a hit in, and immediately sprint away. It would take him a moment to start swinging, so I could successfully escape and he would be too slow to catch up to me, unlike any enemy I encountered previously. When I figured that out, the fight was a piece of cake. And that's it. The game ends after defeating this guy. Right after the fight, I'm confronted by none other than Mr. B, the leader of Anti-Mark, who was actually a showrunner of the hunt all along. This whole time he was actually directing this whole thing to his own tune to raise the ratings of the show and make a huge profit for himself. When he injected Nick, it was not a virus blocker, but a detonator which allowed him to kill Nick at the press of a button. Then someone else comes up from behind and calls the dude Villain. So it was V and not B. Apparently it's the president of the corporation behind the hunt, and he's not happy with Mr. V's manipulation and the attempt to take over the show. Mr. V gets taken away, and Nick has a little chat with the president. I'm not sure if it's a translation error, but the dialogue seems to have a bit of an oxymoron. The president says that Nick is the first to survive the hunt, yet he's also saying that Nick repeated Frankenstein's feat, suggesting that the final boss was the previous survivor. So, which is it? The plot twist of the game is that Nick has proven himself to be a vicious killer, so after winning the hunt, he gets offered the position of a hunter in return for riches. This is a twist that every version of this story had, so let's compare them. In the 1987's The Running Man film, the protagonist gets offered the role of a hunter before the ending, but since he's a goody two-shoes, he refuses the offer without even considering it, and successfully manages to destroy the show and convince all the viewers that they've been brainwashed by lies and propaganda. I already mentioned that I haven't read the original Stephen King's novel myself, but according to a plot synopsis, the protagonist gets offered to be a hunter, but it is also revealed to him that his family that he wanted to provide for by participating in the show has been murdered, so he chose to sacrifice his own life in order to take down the showrunner. Now the more important comparison is with the original Black Mark. Unlike in the other versions, Nick did not win the show. He got very far and killed a lot of people. The showrunners would start getting desperate to take him down, so they revealed his face to the public, allowed the use of firearms. Innocent bystanders started getting in the crossfire of the hunters. In the end, Nick was heavily injured, out of food and painkillers, and he got cornered by some hardened soldiers. Yet, they did not kill him immediately. It was known that the hunters would train specifically for this one purpose. Catching the victim would be both a matter of recognition and fun for them, and they would fully intend to torture the victim as long as brutal as possible to satisfy their sadistic cravings. Yet despite that, these soldiers expressed respect to Nick. The twist was that these elite hunters were all previous victims that disappeared without a trace. They have proven themselves to be tough survivors and ruthless killers, so they were offered to be a part of the show. Nick has passed the same exam, so he was invited too. Experiencing that for the first time, it felt like a pretty cool twist, and the whole story was built up quite well, despite its short length. Through the whole story, Nick became nearly savage. He had thought that he could fire his last few rounds and take out some of the soldiers down with him, but realized that it wouldn't achieve much. So, he ended up accepting the offer. That would be a fairly cool, bittersweet ending, if a little simplistic. But it was also added that Nick's intention was to infiltrate the Black Mark and gradually take it down from the inside. That still gives a little hope, but that's still more realistic than the 1987's film, where years of totalitarian regime and corporate manipulation were undone in a day by pretty much a single man. Now guess what the game's Nick did? He just went, With the way how edgy and unempathetic he was the whole way through, I'm leaning towards the conclusion that he would actually join the show just for the money. And that's the game. I kept sitting in the credit scene waiting for the licensed songs to be mentioned, since I was curious about them, but they never were. The one playing in the credits is Shrag Vdokh by Animal Jazz. I kept waiting and waiting, and it turned out that the credits keep looping forever. That's quite unusual. Before I give my final thoughts in the game, I have some advice to those who might want to experience this jank themselves. I strongly recommend against getting the Russian version, because the original release has Star Force DRM. If you don't know what that is, do not even attempt installing that, because you'll break your Windows. I experienced that firsthand. I can only make an exception for the wizards who are still using Windows XP. Star Force DRM was infamous even back in the day for being a very invasive kernel-level DRM that would even break disk drives, and it breaks any Windows more modern than XP upon installation. If you're not sure what you're doing, do not even touch it. There might be a newer version without Star Force, but I'd recommend not risking mixing them up and getting the French version instead. It has the English dub and the unofficial text translation patch. And if you really want the Russian version, it might be possible to just replace the audio and text files, since they're easily accessible. Also, a tip. The game doesn't have a VSync setting, but for some reason it gets automatically enabled in windowed mode. So if you need it, you can run the game in windowed mode and use some software like Borderless Gaming to make it windowed full screen. So, The Hunt. The Black Mark. I was intrigued when I saw that it's a similar game to my beloved Condemned Criminal Origins, and upon reading the original short story, I thought that it's quite a perfect fit for a video game in that style. Quite surprisingly, The Hunt actually represents both of these things pretty well, even if it feels like a discount version of them. The writing was a bit bare bones, but it did the job. It failed to portray any character development with its protagonist, but the text files did a decent job at establishing the horrors of the hunt. It's quite rare for me to bother reading text logs in games, but I found the setting interesting enough to care about them. It was disappointing that Nick's journal just kind of stopped being updated halfway through the game. It's a little silly that the game was set in the future when it was released, but it's already in the past now. I guess it all already happened in Moscow, we just didn't hear about it. Regardless, the game did a fairly decent job at predicting how 2020 would be. It's pretty much the same shit, just very slightly more technologically advanced and kinda shittier with right-wing powers getting more control. In terms of the game itself, it wasn't quite as polished as Condemned, but it was a really solid and enjoyable copy that had all the same core elements. The fights were pretty fun, the atmosphere was oppressive, and the presentation was wonderfully gritty. Well, at least half of the time. It was a bit of a shame that the atmosphere lost some of that sauce towards the end of the game. The game itself is pretty short. It took me roughly 4 hours playing at a moderate pace. I actually wanted the game to be longer, and I guess that's a great thing that it left me wanting more, because usually these jank games feel like a chore to play, and I feel relief when they're finally over. The game could have had a few more levels and elaborated on some of the mechanics more, as well as the story. What I wanted the most was to use the assault rifles at the end to take revenge on those pesky ninjas, to have a bit of a power trip, but I never got a chance because the assault rifles were introduced in like the last 10 minutes of the game. I think if the hunt was just a bit more polished, unreleased internationally, it would have actually been a really serious competitor to Condemned. I would even go as far as to say that the game is good. I honestly expect way worse when I delve into these old jank games, and I'm content with quite a bit worse. The hunt was actually fun to play. I think it still looks pretty great to this day. The ambience is very appropriately gloomy, and the voice acting, while pretty cheesy, is actually competent. At this point, I don't even mind the hunt being a copycat Condemned, because this sort of game hasn't been replicated since, to my knowledge, even though it's a really great formula. There were some performance hiccups, lighting and audio glitches, some mechanics would sometimes feel a bit clunky, but overall, it's a very bearable level of jank, and it doesn't get too annoying during its short runtime. Speaking of runtime, wow, this video got longer than I anticipated. If you made it all the way here, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed your time. If you like this sort of content, you can support my channel through my Patreon or Ko-fi pages. The links are in the description. I'm Jankbaron, and I'll see you in another video.